A racist neighbor called 911 on a black man mowing his own lawn, claiming he didn't belong. But when he uncovered her darkest secret, she wasn't just exposed. She was destroyed in front of the whole town. The sun hung high over the quiet suburban neighborhood, casting golden rays across neatly trimmed lawns and white picket fences. Birds chirped, children's laughter echoed in the distance, and the scent of freshly cut grass filled the air. But that peace was about to be shattered. Malcolm Carter wiped the sweat from his brow as he guided his lawnmower across his front yard, the hum of the engine drowning out the summer sounds around him. His house, a modest but well-kept brick home, stood proudly on the corner of Maplewood Drive, a house he had worked tirelessly to afford, a house that carried the weight of his dreams and sacrifices. He had just started trimming the edges of his lawn when he noticed her, Margaret Simmons. She stood stiffly on her porch across the street, her sharp blue eyes locked on him like a predator sizing up its prey. Her perfectly pressed beige dress and pearls seemed out of place for a casual Saturday afternoon. But nothing about Margaret was ever casual. She was the self-appointed neighborhood watchdog, a woman who believed her opinions were law, her whispers capable of reshaping reputations. And today, her target was Malcolm. She held her phone to her ear, her lips tight, her face etched with contempt. Malcolm sighed, shaking his head. He had lived here for 3 years, and yet, no matter how many friendly nods, no matter how many waves, he was always an outsider in her eyes. Then, the sirens came. Loud, piercing, growing closer. Malcolm's heart pounded as the unmistakable red and blue lights flashed against his driveway. 2 police cruisers screeched to a halt in front of his house, and before he could even turn off the mower, officers were stepping out, hands hovering near their belts. "Step away from the lawnmower, sir," one officer barked. Malcolm froze, his mind racing. This couldn't be happening. Not again. His neighbors peeked through their curtains, some stepping onto their porches, murmuring among themselves. Some faces were concerned, others smirking, enjoying the show. Margaret, still clutching her phone, wore a look of triumph, like she had just won some twisted game. But she had no idea. The game was about to change. Malcolm slowly raised his hands, swallowing the frustration bubbling in his chest. He had seen this story play out before, too many times, in too many places. A black man, simply existing, met with suspicion. The officer closest to him had a rigid posture, his fingers twitching near his belt. Like Malcolm was a threat. Like the lawnmower in his hands was a weapon. "Sir," the officer repeated, his voice sharp. "We got a report of a suspicious individual trespassing on private property. Mind explaining what you're doing here?" A bitter laugh almost escaped Malcolm's lips. "Trespassing? On his own lawn?" "With all due respect, officer," Malcolm said, keeping his voice measured. "I'm mowing my lawn. The same lawn I mow every Saturday. The same lawn I pay property taxes on." Before the officer could respond, Margaret Simmons interjected, her voice shrill. "He doesn't belong here," she snapped, stepping off her porch. "He's been loitering around the neighborhood. I've never seen him before." The sheer absurdity of the statement made Malcolm's stomach turn. 3 years. 3 years of living in this neighborhood, waving politely, attending HOA meetings. And yet, to Margaret, he was still invisible. Or worse, an invader. One of the officers exchanged glances with his partner, shifting uncomfortably. The second officer, a younger one, looked at Margaret with raised eyebrows. "Ma'am," he asked carefully, "are you saying he doesn't live here?" Margaret's lips pursed. She hesitated. She hadn't expected to be questioned. "I mean, I don't know who actually owns the house," she huffed. "But look at him. He doesn't fit." The younger officer's frown deepened. But before he could say anything, Malcolm took a step forward. "Officer, I can prove I live here." He pulled out his phone, scrolling to the digital copy of his mortgage statement. As he held it up, Margaret's face paled. "Oh, and just so you know," Malcolm added, locking eyes with her, "I know exactly who you are, Margaret, and I know what you've been hiding." Margaret's expression flickered, just for a moment, with something that almost looked like fear. She thought she had control of the situation, but she had no idea what was coming next. A hush fell over the street. The officers exchanged uneasy glances. The neighbors who had gathered, some pretending to water their plants, others peeking from their windows, leaned in just a little closer. Margaret's face, once smug and triumphant, twitched with something close to panic. Her fingers clenched around her phone, knuckles white. What are you talking about? She snapped, her voice wavering just slightly. Malcolm tilted his head, studying her. Now, she was on the defensive. Oh, you know exactly what I'm talking about, Margaret, he said smoothly. You sit in your little house, calling the cops on every black person who so much as walks down the street. But the real question is, what do you have to hide? Margaret scoffed, trying to mask her discomfort. This is ridiculous. Officers, arrest him. He's threatening me. One of the officers, the older one, sighed. He looked at Malcolm. Sir, do you have proof you live here? Without breaking eye contact with Margaret, Malcolm held up his phone again, showing the mortgage statement. Right here. Want me to pull up the deed too? The younger officer nodded. That won't be necessary, sir. Looks like you're the homeowner. Margaret's face drained of color. You see, Malcolm continued, Margaret here loves playing neighborhood police. Always watching, always judging. But funny thing, I came across some very interesting information recently. Margaret took a half step back. You're lying. Malcolm smirked. Am I? He turned to the growing crowd of neighbors, raising his voice just enough for everyone to hear. I wonder if anyone here knows about that little financial scandal from a few years ago. The one where a certain someone was caught embezzling HOA funds. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Whispers started. Margaret's composure shattered. That's a lie, she shrieked, her voice breaking. Oh? So you didn't misplace over 20 grand in neighborhood funds? Malcolm crossed his arms. Because I have some very detailed reports that say otherwise. And guess what? If the cops here don't look into it, I know plenty of reporters who will. Margaret's entire body stiffened. The officers, suddenly far less interested in Malcolm, turned toward her. Ma'am, is there something we should know? Her mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. She had called the cops to ruin Malcolm's day. But now, she was the one about to be exposed. Margaret staggered back, her entire body rigid with panic. The carefully crafted mask she wore in this neighborhood, her self-proclaimed status as a model citizen, was beginning to crack, and Malcolm was hammering at the fault lines. This is ridiculous, she shrieked, looking around for support. I've never stolen anything. This is slander. But the damage was done. The neighbors were no longer whispering about Malcolm. They were whispering about her. The older officer, the one who had been ready to arrest Malcolm just minutes ago, folded his arms. His skeptical eyes locked onto Margaret. Ma'am, if these allegations are false, you have nothing to worry about. But embezzlement is a serious accusation. We might have to look into it. Margaret's face twitched. She suddenly wasn't in control anymore. Malcolm took a step forward, his voice calm but firm. You want to know how I found out? He asked, tilting his head. I've been researching this neighborhood's finances. You see, I planned on investing in some properties here. And imagine my surprise when I stumbled across the financial discrepancies in the HOA records. More gasps from the crowd. A few neighbors stepped back from Margaret, like she carried a disease. Nothing was ever proven, she snapped, but her voice was brittle now. Those records were buried. Malcolm cut her off, raising an eyebrow. Yeah, funny thing about that. Someone made sure they never reached law enforcement. But you know what's even funnier? He turned toward the officers. I forwarded copies to the local news, just in case. Margaret turned sheet white. The younger officer clicked his pen, flipping open his notepad. Ma'am, we're going to need you to answer some questions. Margaret whirled around, her breath coming in short gasps. The neighbors she used to control with her judgmental glares and whispered gossip now looked at her with suspicion and disgust. This is insane, she stammered, her eyes darting wildly. I was only trying to keep the neighborhood safe. I called 911 because I thought, because you saw a black man mowing his own lawn and decided that was a crime. Malcolm finished for her, his voice sharp with restrained anger. Silence. A brutal, suffocating silence. Margaret opened her mouth, then snapped it shut. For the first time since this all began, she had no response. The world she built, the power she wielded, was crumbling in front of her eyes. And Malcolm? He wasn't finished yet. Margaret stood frozen, her lips trembling, as the weight of Malcolm's words pressed down on her. The same neighbors she once manipulated with passive-aggressive comments and fake smiles now stared at her with narrowed eyes, their trust in her shattered beyond repair. Across the street, Mrs. Jensen, an elderly woman who had lived in the neighborhood for decades, shook her head in disgust. All these years, Margaret, you had us believing you cared about this community, and all along, you were the real criminal. Margaret spun toward her. I was looking out for us. We have standards here. We can't just let— You mean people like me? Malcolm interrupted, his voice firm but calm. People who work hard, pay their bills, and expect to be treated like human beings. The younger officer scribbled something in his notebook. Ma'am, we'll need you to come down to the station for questioning. If the financial reports check out, we may be looking at a case of fraud and misappropriation of funds. Margaret's face twisted in rage. This is outrageous. You're taking his word over mine. He's the one who doesn't belong here. That was the final straw. A loud chorus of disapproval rippled through the crowd. She's always had a problem with people who don't look like her, muttered Mr. Delgado, a longtime resident. Remember when she tried to get the Johnsons fined for painting their house the wrong color? Another neighbor whispered. Or how she told the Martins their daughter's loud rap music was making the neighborhood unsafe. Every whisper stripped away another layer of her power. Margaret, once untouchable, now looked small, desperate, exposed. No, no, you're all turning this around, she shrieked. He's the outsider. This is our neighborhood. Malcolm crossed his arms, a slow smirk creeping onto his face. Funny, he mused, because the real outsiders, they're the ones who steal from their own community. Margaret gasped, a sharp, wounded sound, but it was too late. She had lost. The older officer took a step forward, his voice now carrying authority instead of suspicion. Mrs. Simmons, if these allegations hold up, you'll be facing criminal charges. You might want to call a lawyer. For the first time, Margaret had no words, no clever insults, no manipulative excuses. Nothing. The neighborhood had turned against her. And Malcolm. He turned to his lawnmower, finished cutting his grass, on his own damn property, like he always did. Margaret stood motionless, her face pale, her breath uneven. She looked around desperately, searching for someone, anyone, to come to her defense. But the neighborhood that once feared her now saw her for what she really was. Malcolm exhaled slowly, turning off his lawnmower. The scent of freshly cut grass mixed with the stench of Margaret's desperation. The younger officer, clearly more invested now, turned to Malcolm. You said you forwarded the financial reports to the news? Malcolm nodded. Sent it this morning. A few reporters were already interested. They love a good HOA embezzlement scandal. Margaret's lips parted in shock. You— What? Malcolm pulled out his phone, scrolling for a moment before turning the screen toward the crowd. A local news website was already running the headline, and right underneath, a picture of Margaret. The neighbors gasped. Even the officers raised their eyebrows. Margaret's knees wobbled. No, 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 no. You can't do this, she shrieked. This isn't fair. I was protecting this neighborhood. By stealing from it? Malcolm shot back. Her entire body tensed at the accusation, but she couldn't deny it anymore. She had played judge, jury, and executioner for years, calling the police on anyone who didn't fit her picture-perfect version of suburbia, weaponizing authority for her own twisted sense of control. And now, the real authorities were coming for her. The older officer sighed, clearly done with her antics. Ma'am, you need to come with us for questioning. Now. Margaret whipped around, her eyes wild with panic. You're arresting me? But— The officer pulled out his cuffs. Turn around. Margaret let out a wail of disbelief. The moment the cold metal snapped around her wrists, the neighborhood erupted. Some people gasped. Others murmured, about time. And then, a slow, deliberate clap. Malcolm. His hands came together in steady applause, a smirk playing on his lips. Soon, others joined in. Mr. Delgado, Mrs. Jensen, even some of the younger neighbors who had kept their heads down for years. Margaret had ruled this street with fear, but fear only worked when people stayed silent. And now, they weren't silent anymore. The officers led Margaret toward the squad car. She thrashed against their grip, screaming incoherently. I'll sue you all. You'll regret this. He set me up. He's the criminal. Malcolm shook his head. No, Margaret. he said, his voice calm, steady. For once, you're just facing the consequences. The car door slammed shut. The sirens wailed as the police drove away, leaving Margaret to face her fate. Malcolm turned back toward his house, the neighborhood still buzzing with shock. "Hey, Malcolm," Mr. Delgado called out. Malcolm raised an eyebrow. "You ever think about running for HOA president?" Malcolm chuckled, shaking his head. "I think I've had enough neighborhood drama for one day." The neighbors laughed, the tension in the air finally breaking. But Malcolm knew one thing for sure. This street would never be the same again. The sun had barely set when Malcolm's phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't a reporter or a neighbor. It was his lawyer friend, Andre. "You sitting down?" Andre's voice crackled over the line, heavy with amusement. Malcolm smirked. "After today, I don't think I can handle another surprise." "Oh, you're going to want to hear this." Andre chuckled. "Margaret Simmons is in deeper than just HOA fraud." Malcolm sat up straighter. "What do you mean?" Andre sighed. "Public records, my friend. I took a closer look at her financials after your little stunt today. And guess what? That missing HOA money, it's just the tip of the iceberg." Malcolm's grip on the phone tightened. "She's got multiple lawsuits against her," Andre continued. "Misuse of HOA funds is one thing, but she's also been running an illegal eviction scheme." Malcolm's jaw clenched. "She's been forcing out homeowners she didn't approve of, mostly Black and Latino families, by slapping them with fake violations, excessive fines, and bogus complaints. She made their lives hell until they sold their homes." Malcolm felt his stomach drop. So she wasn't just a racist busybody, she was profiting off it. "Bingo," Andre said. "She'd manipulate the HOA rules, hit families with fees they couldn't fight, and when they finally gave up and left, she'd push their properties to buyers she liked. And those buyers, all white." Malcolm's hands curled into fists. She was literally engineering the neighborhood to fit her twisted ideals. Andre exhaled. "And guess who helped her?" Malcolm already knew. "Real estate developers. Yep, some big names too. Developers who wanted to revitalize the neighborhood, but only for the right kind of people." Malcolm gritted his teeth. "Please tell me she's going to prison." "Oh, that's the best part," Andre laughed. "The feds are stepping in. Housing discrimination, wire fraud, conspiracy. You name it, she's getting hit with it. This isn't just a local case anymore. She's done." Malcolm let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. Margaret thought she could bully and erase people like him. She thought she could rewrite history, make sure only people like her controlled the neighborhood. But she had dug her own grave. And now, she was never coming back. A week later, Margaret Simmons was officially the most hated person in town. Her mugshot was plastered across every local news station. Headlines screamed about her fraud, discrimination, and corruption. The HOA board immediately removed her, and every shady deal she had orchestrated was now under investigation by the federal government. But the real icing on the cake, her house, the same house from which she had judged and terrorized the neighborhood, was now up for auction. Malcolm stood on his porch, sipping a cold lemonade, as he watched prospective buyers walk in and out of Margaret's former palace. The irony wasn't lost on him. "Poetic justice, huh?" He turned to see Mr. Delgado walking up his driveway, hands stuffed in his pockets. "Never thought I'd see the day," the older man chuckled. "Margaret, gone. HOA under new leadership. Whole neighborhood finally breathing again." Malcolm smirked. Funny what happens when the right people stop staying silent. Just then, his phone buzzed. A message from Andre. "Guess who just put in the highest bid for Margaret's old house?" Malcolm's eyebrows lifted. He quickly typed back, "Who?" Seconds later, a response. "The Johnsons. The Black family she tried to push out last year. They're moving back." Malcolm grinned. He could already picture Margaret losing her mind in whatever cold jail cell she now called home. The very people she worked so hard to erase were taking back what was theirs. As Malcolm stood there, feeling the warm breeze roll over the neighborhood, he realized something. Margaret had spent years believing she could control who belonged here. But now, the neighborhood had spoken, and they had chosen justice. With a final satisfied nod, Malcolm turned and went back to mowing his lawn, this time with nothing but peace.